Good day. I'm Daryl Sirota, Technical Services Director here at the EstesGroup, and I've been a geek for a long time, but I also speak English. So I thought I would bring some of the challenges that I've seen in the Epicor / SQL world to the table here and talk a little bit about some of the challenges, some of the solutions, some of the just kind of tips and tricks that I've learned as part of my tenure here at the EstesGroup. Been with the EstesGroup almost 6 years now, but I've been a SQL DBA for, well, since before my kids were born, and they made me grandfather now, so it's been a while. So I wanted to share with you some of that. So looking at the poll here, just wanted to come back here. Let's see. So it looks like the majority of folks here are either managing SQL as part of their job description, and then followed up with internal and outside folks are doing it. Fortunately, I've seen a number of people that I've run across, clients that look at SQL Server, and as long as they just overpower the server with more hardware than is possibly ever used, they're good to go, and they probably just kill it with hardware. And although that might be the solution for some smaller clients, I've seen the best hardware brought to its knees by poor SQL management. And so I wanted to bring into the equation, what does that look like? What is the best practices, as it were? So when we look at this, as I go through my presentation, if you have any questions, go ahead and fire them off in the Q&A session. I'm going to be looking at my slides and hopefully not killing you with, killing you with PowerPoint, but rather I'm giving you guys the opportunity to ask the questions that you need, and I'll wrap up with plenty of time where we can chat about it. I'll also be in the after session with the roundtable event, so happy to answer any questions. Perfect. So what is it that we're really talking about here when we look at SQL Server tips and tricks? So the first question would be well, why do I need DBA? Judging by the majority of you saying you are the DBA, maybe this would be a superfluous question. I also want to talk a little bit about SQL licensing, because a lot of times it gets confusing in the Epicor spaces too. When you bought Epicor, did Epicor give you your SQL licenses, or are you buying them independently? And as we scale this solution up and scale it out, licensing can certainly become a part. I will talk, of course, about security, because that's a big part of a DBA job, especially in this day and age, when we look at what is keeping it secure, making it high performance. Performance and redundancy, high availability are two very separate things, but we'll talk about how do we make this thing survive a failure. I thought I'd come along with a couple of common scripts that I use. In fact, I've written these scripts time and time again, so I wanted to share some scripting tools with you. And then lastly, what's the difference between proactive and reactive administration, and what can you do to make your job a little bit more comfortable? So when we ask, why do I need a DBA anyway? Well, a DBA, or a database administrator, is responsible for any number of things. And I've just listed the top 10 or 12 here. In terms of your database administrator, of course, is responsible for keeping the SQL Server up, right? If it's not up, then you don't have a job. Part of that is making sure your backups run, that your backups are valid, and how do you recover from those backups? Monitoring SQL Server jobs, right? A lot of this stuff in Epicor occurs as part of the task agent, and that, while that's not a SQL Server job, I've seen several clients that will write additional SQL scripts to move data, transform data, back up their databases. And if those backups and those jobs aren't running properly, you need to know, when do those jobs fail and what does that impact in your organization? Managing dry space, right? Databases grow. Management always wants more databases. Management wants to be able to keep tabs on, I need to have 5 backups 5 different ways, and so making sure that you don't run out of disk space, not only your primary SQL storage, but your backup storage. Index fragmentation. Indexes are a necessary evil of SQL Server, and they fragment, and if you're not managing your fragmentation, then you have a slower performing server than you ought to. Looking at, of course, the security aspect, security and patch management. Are you running the latest SQL? Not only do we run the latest SQL because it runs better, but because they fix bugs. We have to patch Windows every so often, just because if this thing is exposed to the internet, arguably now if it's exposed to your end users are your worst enemy. So we want to make sure that your system is patched. Keeping track of data movement, capacity planning, performance monitoring, all these things are, oh, and troubleshooting, of course, right? When it doesn't work well or it's too slow, how do you go about troubleshooting that thing? And of course, management is always coming along saying, well, we need you to do this with the database, or we need to move this data from point A to point B. And so being able to respond to those management requests, change requests, is always a DBA's responsibility. So this could be a full-time job in your organization, depending on how many SQL servers you've got, how frequently you're having to kind of babysit them. And so this is why you need a DBA, or you need to be a DBA. So let's look at the, of all of those things, I just picked some of the top handful. I wanted to talk about SQL licensing. First off, SQL is not free. You might have got it along with your purchase of Epicor, as a number of our clients do, but it's not free. And if you get that licensing wrong, it can be a fairly expensive day when Microsoft comes knocking on the door and asks you to true up your licenses. We've had Microsoft audits here at the EstesGroup. We get audited every couple of years, and making sure that you've got the right additions running for the right users. Now, SQL is an almost honor system. That is, once you purchase standard edition or enterprise edition, let's say, you can install that all over the place, and you can put as many users and as many processors, cores as you want. But come the day of truing up with Microsoft auditing department, you'll realize that a 4-core minimum, for example, per processor can be expensive if you got it wrong. I've seen a lot of system administrators say, oh, we'll make this go faster by adding more cores, and they never up their SQL licenses to match those cores. And so therefore, it could be a bad day when you realize you're running 16 processors against a SQL engine, and you're only licensed for 4. It's a 5-figure true up cost, if it were. So your license can be per user, where you buy the license to run the SQL Server, and then you have the each user. Now, the user doesn't have to log into SQL. In this case, it would actually be an Epicor user. That would be your person that's accessing the SQL data. So users aren't just SQL clients, but they're Epicor clients as well. So most folks go to per core licensing. And what that means is that for every 2 cores you run on a SQL server, you have to license it. There's a minimum of 4 cores. If you have any questions about this, see me afterwards. Also, your Microsoft licensing expert, often on staff, or your vendor would be happy to provide you with more details. Now, we do also often get the question of production versus test environments. And that really comes down to, if you have a user, whether it's a testing user or a real user connecting to that SQL, then it needs a license. Now, there are several different types of licenses. Typically, we talk about standard versus enterprise edition. If you're a big enough shop, you might choose to run this Microsoft Developer Network. And the Developer Network is a way that you can run multiple SQL servers for your developers, AKA testers. But in most cases, that environment is going to need a license. And it's going to be typically a standard or perhaps enterprise edition, depending on how closely you need your test environment to match the production environment. One of the ways that we get around the licensing challenges is to put multiple SQL instances on a single operating system. And I've seen this question a lot, where I've got a production environment and a test environment, and we can put all of those databases in a single SQL instance. Or if you wanted to split them out, you can dedicate a separate instance on a single operating system. And Microsoft lets you run those multiple instances for the same cost, the same license, as running a single instance. So here, for example, in our Echo hosting environment, we have clients that are comfortable with running a dedicated instance for their tenant all on a single operating system. And as long as that single operating system is resilient and scaled properly, that's a great way to be able to have an instance for your production environment, an instance for your developers, an instance for your tests, an instance for SharePoint. That might not have to do with Epicor at all. They can all be run on a kind of enterprise class server. One of the things that I've seen frequently is that if you split SQL, the SQL engine, and the SSRS reporting function onto two separate operating systems, then you're going to need not only another operating system license for Windows, but you're going to need another SQL license. So to run SQL engine on one box is 4 core minimum. And then to run SSRS on another operating system, you're going to need another 4 core SQL license to be able to run SSRS across. So that splitting apart, we'll talk about that under performance, but keep that in mind that if you have more SQL running, that includes the engine and SSRS that we see all the time in Epicor deployments, you're going to need more licenses. So again, happy to answer any questions as we get down the road. So SQL licensing, a big part that people often are not aware of when it comes to scaling this thing up. So SQL security is a big aspect. You've heard me talk in the past couple of years, it's all about security. And I absolutely believe that when it comes to a SQL server, that's where your golden nuggets are, right? If the bad guys can break into your Epicor solution and be able to read data or write data, then all sorts of bad things can happen. So who's an administrator, right? An admin is first off somebody with physical access to your SQL server. If you're not encrypting your data, and I can walk into your server room, I could boot your SQL server with my boot CD or flash drive and get access to your databases. If I'm a local Windows administrator, then chances are I've got a way to break into your SQL server. You might not even know it. And then of course, if you have somebody who's a SQL sysadmin, that's a member of the sysadmin role, they're an administrator. And database owners, they're administrators to that database. So then it comes down to the question of who's got access to the database. Well, of course, all your known sysadmins have access to the databases, and all of your known Epicor users have some access. Well, Epicor users don't necessarily have access to the database. They use an Epicor service account. But with read access to your SQL database, I can get to the data that might bypass the business rules. Right? If I'm able to look at the SQL database with Management Studio or Excel reporting or SSRS, I can use that to bypass some of the business logic. So you might find that users that have ODBC access to the database can start reading all of your part numbers and reading all of your vendors and finding when you last ordered stuff and things like that, even though they might not be part of the ordering process as far as Epicor. So keep in mind that whoever's got access to the database can bypass that business logic. And with write access to your database, boy, that's a dangerous thing because I can update data. Updating data means that I can edit information. And even though Epicor stores your Epicor logins, that's your traditional Epicor logins that most folks are still using, that password is hashed, which means I can't go into the database and look at what somebody's Epicor password is, but I can reset it. So that means if I needed to reset a user's password with access to the database, it's a simple update command, and I reset user passwords. And that's kind of nice because when we do migrations, we bring people into the Echo environment and folks say, well, I don't know what my manager password was. You know, Epicor used manager password when they installed the system umpteen years ago, and I don't use it anymore, but maybe we need access to those accounts. So with the sysadmin access and write access to that database, I'm going to go ahead and update the manager password and quote, break back into the system. Yes, it's your system. Yes, I have permissions to do that. But imagine the bad guys being able to update your passwords without your knowledge, well, without your permission. A big part about SQL security also is your data leaking out of SQL? Usually it's intentional leakage, but just keep aware that your data probably moves outside of Epicor into a variety of different places. For example, we have a number of our Echo clients that use this e-commerce solution called PartTrap or Magento. There's all sorts of ways. And what we end up doing is we replicate data from Epicor databases into some third-party solution. which is fine, it's desirable, but make sure your third-party folks are secure, that they're also treating your data nicely, and they're not leaking your data out to, you know, anybody who asks for it. Certainly exporting your data, downloading it to Excel, giving API access, right? Epicor is a great solution for being able to consume data through the REST API. We do it all the time. And being able to see, you know, how many orders are outstanding, how many jobs, writing third-party dashboards, all that's done through APIs. And you need to make sure that if your data is leaking out through an API, at least you're aware of where that is and who's hosting it and where it ends up at the end of the day, right? So one of the biggest dangers is downloading Epicor data to an Excel spreadsheet. And then those spreadsheets have a nasty habit of ending up on local hard drives. And once they're on local hard drives, then you have generally not a whole lot of control over them. So make sure that those folks that can download to the Excel spreadsheets know how to treat those spreadsheets in a confidential manner. So lots of questions about security. I just thought I'd open Pandora's box, share with you some of the things that I see frequently in the Epicor space. SQL backups is a huge part of being a SQL DBA. Knowing what your recovery point objective and recovery time objectives is critical. Now, I often ask the question of my clients, when's the last time you had to restore? Believe it or not, most of the time they don't need to restore. Now, yes, there are some Epicor admins that want to back up production and restore to test. I've got a script on that later. But that type of a disaster recovery is something that if you're not aware of, it will reach up and bite you in a bad way. Now, it's one thing to do a SQL maintenance plan to do a backup. And if you see the maintenance plan and there's your BAK file and you're happy and you think that that's working, great. That's a good start, don't get me wrong. But unless you restore that backup, you don't have a warm fuzzy that you've got a real backup, right? You've got to test those backups. And when you think you got it right, test it again. And then after you think you got it right, then pretend that your entire SQL server melted down with a bad service pack, or it blew up with a bad RAID controller, or the user said format C: when they thought they were on the test server, all sorts of things. So being able to restore a database is one thing. Being able to restore the entire SQL server, master, MSDB, drive carvings, support files, SQL jobs, all those things that make your SQL server do what it's supposed to do, is a really good test. If you've never done a disaster recovery of your SQL server, don't be surprised if it takes you 2 or 3 days to restore. Now, some of you have third-party tools. You say, well, you know, not only do we do a SQL maintenance plan, but we use Veeam, or we use Backup Exec, or we use other utilities that are backing up the SQL server. And I'm going to tell you right now that that's great, but multiple backup strategies, multiple backup plans can reach out and bite you really bad. The reason for that is when you back up with SQL, it records, I did a backup. And then when it goes to do a restore, it knows via the MSDB file what backups you did. And whether they were full backups, differential, transaction log, I don't care. It knows what backups you did. So when you go to restore, it says, well, here's your last full backup, and here's all the transaction logs that transpired since. So when you go to do a restore, you need to restore full, and then you restore your incrementals or your differentials or however you restore. But if you have a third-party utility that's also doing backups, the last full backup might be not from your maintenance plan, but from Veeam. And so when you go to do a restore, all of a sudden you go, well, who's got the latest backup? Was it my maintenance plan that did it, or was it Veeam that did it? I don't know. So you test it and you realize that multiple backup plans, you have to be aware of who's got the latest copy of your data. And restoring that might be a hodgepodge of patching Veeam with the backup plan, with incremental restores, and it can be a mess really quick. And the biggest problem with having to restore under the gun is that when the fires are burning brightly, the boss is breathing down your neck saying, SQL's down, Epicor's down, we need it restored right away. And if you can't say with authority, my recovery points objective is to get the server back up in, I don't know, 2 hours. Maybe you can survive 2 hours of downtime. And my recovery time, that's my recovery time objective, is how quickly can I get it back up? And my recovery point objective, that is how much data can I afford to lose? Okay, maybe if I can afford to lose 2 hours of data, it means I've got to back up every 2 hours, and that backup has to be off disk, because there are 9 easy ways to lose your data. If you've never had, if you want to lose some sleep tonight, go to Brent's website here. Brent is our amazing guy. I've not met him yet, but I plan to. Maybe when all this is over. That there's 9 different ways and more for you to lose your data. I've seen every one of these ways in my tenure as a SQL DBA. And one of those is, I ran out of disk space, so I'm going to delete all of these BAK files so that my databases keep running. If you delete all your BAKs, then those are backups. You might very well be destroying the data that you need to restore from if data is corrupt. So with SQL backups, you got to test it, and don't test on a special backup, right? If you do a special backup just so you can prove that it can restore, that's no good. What about the backup you just did 2 hours ago or last night? Restore that puppy and use that as your fire drill. And that way you're going to make sure that you have a functional system when it melts down next week, because the SAN guys didn't realize that you were storing SQL Server on those disks. And so they destroyed a set of disks, or they reallocated the SAN, or again, 9 different ways, easy ways to lose your data. So make sure that you test this thing and that everybody knows what the expectations are for your recovery points objectives and your recovery time objectives. I spend a whole lot of time in this environment when we are in this area when I look at clients as we come in for a managed services solution. We ask the business owners, what's your recovery point objective, right? How much data can you afford to lose? What's your recovery time objective? That is, how long is it going to take to get it back up and running? And that can be a scary thing if you've never done that fire drill. So jump off my soapbox about backups. Any questions here? Go ahead and post them in the chat window. I'm happy to answer. SQL performance is a big issue of a DBA's job, and I see this a lot. People will tend to just throw more hardware at the solution, thinking that, well, 8 processors with 64 gigs of RAM is going to be more than enough. And for a small solution, they might very well be right? If you have SSD hard drives not spinning Rust, they perform much, much faster. Flash drives are faster than spinning Rust. But on the other hand, a bad query is a bad query, and it will take a long time to execute. And I've seen this happen many, many times. So a couple of just tips and tricks here. You might have already done this in your environment. You want to separate your database and log volumes. And this is true even if you're virtualized. And the reason is that the I/O patterns of the databases are very different than the I/O patterns of a transaction log. And when you put those volumes out there, make sure you format them with 64K clusters. If you just said format F:, it will default to 4K clusters, and you have inefficiencies. SQL loves 64K I/O. So make sure your clusters are formatted 64K. You can confirm that with a check disk command. It will tell you what your cluster allocation unit is. Unfortunately, if you did it wrong, you just have to format the hard drive with the right cluster. Formatting your hard drive does lose all the data on the drive. So you might need to test your backups before you format your hard drive. Hey, maybe you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone. You'll format with 64K clusters and test your backup plans all in the same day. I recommend you do that knowing that your backups are good, not testing it for the first time. Okay, SQL maintenance plans. Great way to start. In fact, most of our SQL servers that have been set up by Epicor have a maintenance plan in place. The maintenance plan can do all sorts of things. They can do backups. They can delete old backups. They can do index maintenance. And index maintenance is one of the places that I see a lot of Epicor solutions fall down. And that's because index maintenance has online versus offline. and reorganization versus rebuilding a database. So reorg versus rebuild, they all are index maintenance, but if you have standard edition of SQL, you can't rebuild or recreate an index online. SQL won't allow it. You have to have the enterprise edition to do online rebuilds of your indexes. So maybe it's not too bad. You just kick all of your users out of Epicor. You shut down the Epicor web application. You turn off the task agent. Now your SQL database is effectively single user, and you can rebuild your indexes to your heart's content. Most of the time, users aren't allowed to do that. The middle of the night is when we're doing things like MRPs and other Epicor processes that need the database online. So depending on your edition of SQL, you might have to get away with a less efficient rebuild versus less efficient reorg, as opposed to a rebuild of your indexes. There's a great website, Ola Hollengren, another person whom I've never met, but I've heard that she's won SQL Best of Awards for many, many years. They've got a script out there that will do index maintenance for you like nobody's business. And that will absolutely help you in your SQL performance. If you're in any way disk bound, as most SQL environments are, defragging your indexes is an easy, free way to get more performance out of your SQL Server. One of the other things that SQL maintenance plans can do is delete old backups. And I've seen this work about 50% of the time. The SQL maintenance plan has a step that says, get rid of old backups, right? If the backup is more than 2 weeks old, I don't need it on my hard drive anymore. The problem is that a lot of times that step doesn't work. And so backup jobs continue to grow and fill the disk. And full disks are a quick way to bring down your SQL Server. So make sure you're monitoring free disk space so that you don't fill up your disk and stop doing backups, or worse yet, stop a database. So a couple of different ways there. Maintenance plan is a good start, but probably not the end game when it comes to maintaining your SQL databases. Some folks, in order to get performance out of their SQL Server, they will separate the SQL engine from SSRS. And the reason they do that is because, again, the SQL engine, that is your database engine, and reporting services are two fundamentally different things. They have different I/O patterns. Most people, when they start running SQL in an Epicor solution, they'll put the engine and SSRS on the same box. And that's fine, as long as they don't fight for resources. For example, the SQL engine will use all of the RAM that it knows about, actually to the detriment of the operating system, to the detriment of SSRS. And so what you'll find is that you look at the memory allocation in the SQL SQL OS, an OS that's running SQL, and it's got 95% memory utilization. And SSRS is struggling to survive because it doesn't have enough RAM to breathe. So it's getting squeezed. And if you're doing other things on your SQL Server, like third-party processes, for example, P21 loves to run SQL Server, SQL side processes. So P21 environments actually need more room to breathe than an E10 environment. So when you split the engine and SSRS, that's great. Don't forget about your licenses. If you're not going to split them because it doesn't make sense in your organization, at least limit the amount of RAM that your SQL engine can use. It's typically, I'll let it use 80% of the RAM of the server, and I'll leave 20% for SSRS and the operating system. Now, RAM is cheap. You can always throw more RAM at it. If you throw more RAM at it, don't forget to make sure that SQL's memory allocation is set up properly to use the additional RAM, but not 100% of the RAM. So there's that ratio. Again, the 80-20 rule applies relatively well. Your mileage may vary. Now, one of the other challenges that I've seen a lot in SQL servers where both the engine and SSRS are on the same box is that we have these report designers, not Joe, he does it right, but we've got people that will write really bad SQL queries for their reports. It'll have sub-reports, and the sub-report will go off and do crazy things. So to run the report actually requires a lot of resources to render all of the report fields. And so what happens is the SSRS engine goes to 100% utilization because it's busy doing stuff, it's CPU utilization. Now, once SSRS goes to 100% CPU, it doesn't, SQL doesn't have enough resources to execute the SQL commands. So it slows SSRS down, which makes SSRS upset, which means it runs even harder. And so what we end up with is a race condition or a runaway condition. Users usually call up the help desk and they go, Epicor's down. And you look at the Epicor server, or SQL server, and you see it's pegged at 100% CPU. And then you look more closely and you see that SSRS is using 100% of the CPU of your SQL server. So you restart the SQL reporting services service and things fall back down to normal and people go, okay, thanks, you fixed Epicor. And meanwhile, you've got a runaway report. And the next time the user tries to run that report, if you're lucky, it'll send, or not lucky, it'll send SQL back to 100% utilization. And what we end up doing is finding out which report sent it up to 100%, why did it do it, and we fix the report. But meanwhile, every time they run the report, your SQL server crashes. So the way we fix that is to split the engine from SSRS. So if SSRS goes to 100% utilization, great, it's not going to take SQL down, so it just stops the report, not all of Epicor. On the other hand, Microsoft used to have a resource management tool. They got rid of it. I'm not quite sure why. Probably so these companies could come along with other third-party tools to help rein in these runaway processes. And so if you are running SSRS and SQL on the same box, not only do you need to properly allocate memory, but you need to properly allocate or lasso in your CPU so that SSRS doesn't go crazy when it hits 100%. And so therefore I can absolutely recommend an awesome program called Process Lasso. It's by bitsum.com. It's not an expensive program. Go ahead and create a copy of that. There's an eval. I don't work for them. I'm the EstesGroup, but Bitsum has this great program that will let your bad reports try to go to 100%. And Process Lasso will rein them in and still give room for SQL to breathe so that Epicor doesn't crash. Yes, the report is still a bad report. Yes, you need to still figure out what that report is doing. But on the flip side, you want to make sure that you're not losing your user's confidence because of one bad report. Okay, so lots about SQL performance. We could spend a whole lot of time here, but index maintenance, that is maintaining and re-indexing your indexes, making sure you're not spinning out on CPU or memory, and you might as well get the best performance out of your disks, unless you're running SSDs, in which case they have they tend to offload a lot of that bottleneck to the CPU and the network channels rather than the disk subsystem. So moving on, redundancy and high availability. So really the question here is how much downtime can you afford? And we talked about the backups and the disaster recovery already. This is not about disaster recovery as much as it is about trying to make our system resilient against a failure. We already use RAID hard drives, for example. With a RAID hard drive, right, one drive can fail and the system stays running. We can do memory redundancy. All of the new servers for the past, I don't know, 10 or 12, 15 years have had redundant RAM. So if a memory chip goes bad in the server keeps running with another bad, with all the remaining memory. It just has a bad chip, but doesn't crash. Those types of servers that are not resilient and you fail a hard drive or you fail a memory or you fail a processor, the server blue screens and you're reaching for your backups. So there's a number of different things that we have to make your systems highly available, right? Resilient and redundant. How much downtime can you afford is the question I always come back to, because if you can't afford to be down, that's great. We can build a solution where you have very little downtime, unexpected downtime, I should say. There's always downtime that you've got for patching or testing, upgrades and things like that, but that's a maintenance window. Outside of the maintenance window, if you can't afford to be down, then there's a number of different solutions depending on what your recovery time, your uptime has to be. And so that might be looking things like VMware or Hyper-V failover solutions. And this is basically where you're replicating your VMs to another storage, to another host. And if that VM blows up, you just boot it somewhere else. In our Echo environment, for example, we do replication of our SQL servers. And if our SQL server were to blow up, and I simply reboot SQL as it looked 5 minutes ago, actually 15 seconds ago if I really wanted to, which means that our redundancy is very high in our Echo environment. We've got a lot of companies that depend on us to run SQL Server well, and so that's why we have our high availability solutions there. Now, you can use SQL always on availability groups. If you have the standard edition of SQL, you can do that. It's kind of hokey because it's only one database per availability group. And the copies are offline. That is, standard edition, you can replicate all your data to another server. That's all the databases and transaction logs. And if there's a failure in the primary, it will automatically fail over to the secondary, and Epicor will switch over. Now, it will be a hiccup during a failover of an always-on availability group because the database was running on server A failed for whatever reason, and now the database is spun up on server B. Any transactions that were in flight or in process are rolled back. Any committed transactions are rolled forward. So with the always-on availability group, even if you do a failover, users will notice. Epicor does recover, but if a person's in the middle of a screen, they're going to have to back out and reopen it, and they'll find that none of that screen session was saved, right? Transactions are rolled forward or rolled backwards depending on their completeness. Enterprise Edition is nice. Well, you pay a lot of money for Enterprise Edition. So Enterprise Edition allows your replicas to be read-only. And it allows you to wrap up multiple databases in a single availability group. So you can actually set up Epicor to do all of the reporting off of the standby server, the secondary server, so that it doesn't hit the primary server for reporting, which is another potential drag on your database. So with Enterprise Edition, you can say my users are entering data on server A, and SSRS, the shared data source, is running all against server B, and splitting what they call OLTP, online transaction processing, from DS, decision support. It's been an age-old conundrum, is that we split those two behaviors, right? Users enter data in the database A, and we report off of database B. And so that way you have some best of both worlds. But Enterprise Edition, two copies of Enterprise Edition on two different servers, is not small potatoes in terms of your licensing costs. You could also use a standby server, and we see this a lot in our backup environments, and that could be simply we're backing up our server every 15 minutes, and if something happens to our production SQL server, then we simply boot it up in a standby or virtual or disaster recovery mode. And we see this a lot with smaller companies that can't afford the enterprise licensing or virtualization technologies. So we use a tool. One of the tools that we use is a product called Datto. And Datto can take a snapshot of a server every 10 minutes. And if you declare a disaster, that backup server can be up and running in about 10 minutes in the Datto device. So that's really great for some smaller companies that don't have a whole lot of money to spend in the online high availability, but they yet need to be able to have systems up and running within 15 minutes of declaring a disaster. And that's pretty slick when it comes to the price point for a backup solution as well as a disaster recovery solution. Happy to talk more about that during our roundtable discussion, but that's one way you can do standby servers. Datto is not the only game in town. There are several other products. I know a lot of clients that use Veeam. As long as you test it and you make sure it's all working, you don't want to find out that your backups aren't working on the day the fire breaks out. Okay, moving forward. I wanted to talk about some common scripts, some tips and tricks that we have here that I do a lot of. There are some tools that we use in our scripting world to make life easier. In fact, anything that you can do in SQL in the GUI environment can be scripted, which is great because scripts mean you can do it again and again the same time, exactly the same way. In fact, there are some companies that are such purists, they never run anything in the Management Studio interactively against the server. They use SQL Management Studio to create a script. And then they take the script and they run it against the server. Actually, those purists, they'll run it against the dev box first. Then they'll run it against the QA box. Then they'll run it against the production box, right? Because they have 3 different environments, a development server, a QA server, and a production server. Now, most of the small companies don't have the resources to run 3 servers, 3 SQL servers, much less maintain all of that. So a lot of smaller clients just fire and forget, right? They grab SQL Server Management Studio. They say, we're going to take this database and make it read a simple recovery mode. Boom, online. And it's a relatively low risk thing. It has impact, but it's low risk. So some of the tools that we use, I'm a huge PowerShell fan. If you've ever spent any time with me, I write PowerShell scripts because it's faster than typing, faster than mousing around in Management Studio. And PowerShell has a SQL module that will let you extend PowerShell into all things SQL. So with this PowerShell module, I can write a script to copy production to test, for example, because there's a lot of steps, and I'll get to those very shortly. We could write a PowerShell module to recreate a server, to back up and restore, to anything that you want to do. In fact, we have some clients that use PowerShell to modify data. Now, many clients they'll use Transact SQL or T-SQL, and they'll run a script against a database to edit a record number, to reset a Epicor password. I use PowerShell to execute that type of SQL command. So one of the nice things is that with PowerShell module is there's lots of help out there online. There's also help over here. And you can use that to automate. With the SQL Management Studio script to file, I use this a lot to recreate SQL replication. SQL replication, which is common in e-commerce solutions, is a fairly long-winded thing to set up. The problem with replication is that every time you restore a database, you have to recreate the replication environment. So I can't restore a database without destroying the replication. Great, now once I've destroyed it, how do I build it again? You don't want to do that kind of stuff manually. So what I use is SQL Management Studio to script the SQL replication setup to a file. So now when a customer says, hey, I need you to back up production, restore it to test, and by the way, test is replicated to our test part trap environment, it's literally 2 commands, one to copy production to test and another to set up the replication. In fact, we string them together and now it's 1 command. And I don't have to worry about all of the headaches in getting replication set up again, because in a replicated environment, that is a common task for your DBA to have to do. Okay, so lots of common tools. One of the, a couple of tools that I wanted to show you, or scripts that I wanted to share with you, not in the details, but in the generic, is how do we copy production to test? How do we, when you copy production to test, there's some things that you have to do, and sometimes you have to add a task agent for your test environment. And Epicor has a maximum of 3 task agents that can be run against one Epicor database. Now, most of us in the small potatoes world or mid potatoes world, they have an Epicor server that runs the task agent service. And that task agent service will run up to 20 tasks in parallel. And that's how your reports get run. It's how your MRPs get run. It's how you do all sorts of automated things. The problem is that if one of those tasks in the task agent gets hung or gummed up, then the whole task agent stops and says, we're not going to do anything more until this bad job gets cleared out of the task agent queue. And that means that reporting stops. And until you actually restart the task agent, nobody runs reports. This is a common failure in the E10 world. People will go, reporting's broken again, and the Epicor administrator goes in and they restart the task agent. and now reports are running. Magic. Now, just simply restarting the task agent isn't a fix for the problem. The problem is a corrupt report or a corrupt process was gumming up the task agent, crashing the task agent. But you can absolutely, as part of your high availability, install the task agent service on another operating system and point it to the same database. So now you have two task agents. Task agent 1 is running all of the MRPs and task agent 2 is running all the reports or everything else. And you can actually dedicate which task agent gets what type of a job if you want, okay? But you can only have 3 task agents. Epicor put that hard limit in there. So when you restore a database into test, it remembers all the task agents that it had before, and you can't add a 4th one because for testing purposes, because 3 is the max. So I'm giving you a script today, free for the price of admission, how you can free up so that your test environment can get a task agent. Boy, say that 3 times fast. Up and running so that you can do your testing, obviously. Another script that is, I don't want to say common, but is available is, let's set a database to simple recovery mode and truncate the transaction logs. Now, that's easy to say, but dangerous to do. If a database is set into simple recovery mode, that means the database can only be restored via a full database restore. There is no transaction log or point in time recovery. And for some databases, that might be okay. Others, it might be really painful, right? I don't want my Epicor production database in simple recovery mode because if it were to corrupt, I'm falling to last night's backup to be able to restore it. That's no good, right? I might lose 23.5 hours of data according to Murphy. On the other hand, what we can do is some databases are fine in simple recovery mode. Your test database, because you don't need to do point-in-time recovery to test. That's usually superfluous. We usually play with test and then we wipe it out with another copy of production. So let me show you the script that I would use. This is kind of the pseudocode, if you will, to do the restore. And that is basically, we're going to do a backup of the production database with the copy only and compression flags turned on. A lot of people do SQL backups without compression, putting a lot more bits on the hard drive than they need to. And we're going to use copy only because I don't want this to interfere with my regular nightly backup jobs. Copy only says, do the backup, but don't tell anybody you did the backup. And compression just squeezes the BAK file. Then we've got the backup of the production database. We're going to have to stop the target database and the E10 task agent because you can't restore a database that's in use. So stopping the test web app and the test task agent is going to be necessary to be able to restore the file. And so then the next step would be to restore the database. And after you restore the database of your production, it's going to have the same recovery mode as production. So you might choose to put that target database in simple recovery mode and shrink the transaction logs. Why use all that disk space if you don't need it? Okay. And that puts that test database in a smaller, more lean and mean, a little bit faster too, with no transaction log. Then you'll have to restart the task agent and because of the web app. And by the way, whenever database access is interrupted, the task agent gets really offended. It gets gummed up and it needs to be restarted. So you want to restart the web app and then the task agent. I actually had those reversed. So web app first and then task agent. Now, once you've restored your test application, you then are probably going to go into the E10 application and change things like the company name, right? I don't want the company name being the same as the production company name. Change it to test EstesGroup. And that way people, when they run their reports and they're looking at screens, they know they're working in the playground and not in the production environment. The search URL will be reflective of the production search URL. And if you're testing search, then you'll need to update that URL because it'll have the wrong search index. And if you're using Service Connect, Manifest, Bartender, any one of 100 third-party add-ins, those things will have to be updated also because the restored copy of the database is going to think it's production. So you're probably going to need to change those application settings to say, no, we're test. And last but by no means least, and this is kind of a shoe-in for Joe, If you back up and restore the database, that doesn't copy any custom reports that you've written. So if you have custom reports that are in production and they've been updated and you need to copy them to test, moving the SQL database doesn't move the reports. You'll have to do that yourself, or another PowerShell script. Or if Joe's nice, he'll show you the way to do it inside Epicor. And if you change, depending on how you move those reports over to the test environment, don't forget to update your shared data sources. There's nothing worse than running a report in test and having it pull production data, and you scratching your head trying to figure out why it doesn't reflect the test data. That's often because of the shared data source. So lots of ways to do that. What I wanted to do here is show you the command that would help us do that. In this case, it is a shared a command here. This is actually kind of PowerShell-esque. The $ is the giveaway, in that we have back up the database. In this case, I'm backing up a database called training DB, and we're putting it out to a disk file called something.bak with the compression and copy only. We're going to overwrite that BAK file and just tell me every 10% when the backup gets run. Then I'm going to stop the task agent by using the PowerShell command that says get the service off of whatever my test server is, and Epicor ICE is the name of the Windows service that is the task agent. So we stop that service. And this is kind of version agnostic. I like this because I don't care whether you're running E10.1 or E10.2, et cetera, this will catch that task agent and stop it. We also then stop the Windows activation service, and that stops IIS and all of its dependent services. And then we do the restore command, which says we're going to restore the production database from the disk, and we're going to move the database files. So the database files as they existed on the production server, the paths will be different in your test, or the names will be different in your test. So this is a command that basically says take the logs and move them over here. Take the databases and move them over there. Again, depending on your environment, this command will be different, different paths. Then we start up the task agent and the Windows services, IIS application pools. We start that up. And these two commands here say, these are all the services that you're going to want to start. And we push that into a PowerShell command. And at the very end, I tell the user, don't forget to update your company description and all those other things inside the Epicor application. And you might choose to copy SSRS reports, et cetera, fix replication. But this is kind of a high-level script that I run all the time in our Echo environment, because users say, hey, can you copy production down to test again? And I go, sure. And with a script, it's a single click, and I can go about and do it. And any of you folks that are Echo customers, that's an easy ticket. It takes me 5 minutes to run the ticket. It takes me longer to get into the server to start the script than it actually does to do the copy. Okay, this is the script to do your task agents and fixing the task agent maximum. You want to run this in the test database, not in the production database. If you run this in the production database, all your task agents go away. So make sure this is in the test environment right before you stand up a new test task agent. I was going to give you the script to set databases in simple recovery mode and get the transaction log, but I decided against it because it's a really dangerous script. If you accidentally run that in production, you ruin your backup strategy. And I don't want to do that without proper consulting, proper eyeballs. So I want to wrap up here with the difference between proactive and reactive administration. And this is true of any service, and SQL is no different, right? If you're reactively managing your environment, every day is a surprise, right? You don't know what you're walking into when you walk into your office. When are you going to have to buy more disk, CPU, licenses? How many more users can I take on before I have to buy more stuff? What does my recovery point and recovery time objectives looks like? And you know, well, it hasn't broken yet, so no big deal, right? If it hasn't broken in the last year, it's not going to break in the next year. Murphy's watching and working hard against you. If you're proactive, then you'll know what to expect within reason, right? Users will be users. Report writers will be report writers, but we reasonably can expect that that's not going to ruin my day. And being able to trend this thing will show me resource utilization over time, that I know when I'm going to run out of disk space. I know how many users I can take on before I need to buy another SQL Server, etc. And it also gives us a defined disaster recovery plan. So if you have a disaster, it's not a, oh my gosh, what do I do? Throw your hands in there and run around in circles. It's, here's the script. This is our disaster recovery. So in that vein, I would encourage you to look out at our services. I promised I wouldn't give it a sales pitch, but here it is. Estes Cloud Managed Services. Some of you are taking advantage of this already, where your DBA experts are a phone call or a ticket away. Okay, you can have us available to help you with your issues proactively. And that can be both an on-premise solution where we manage your on-prem servers. We do this for a number of Epicor clients. We manage the Epicor box and the SQL box, and then it's a no-brainer. We also can take the whole problem off of your hands if you choose to have us host your ERP solution, right? If you're tired of running your servers, if your servers are old, if it's time for an upgrade, then maybe it's time to talk about Echo, which is our Estes Cloud hosting platform, where we can host your ERP, and we'll take care of all the DBA work. You don't have to worry about it because it's under the hands of the experts. So with that, I'm going to open up to any questions. I think I've run right up to the edge. I'm not as good at my timing as Brad is. So with that, I'm going to shut up and turn the keys back over to Cindy, and I'll watch the chat line and the QA line here for any questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to talking to you in the roundtable.